On that thick and humid night of May 23, 1918, the air of New Orleans seemed frozen, as if nature itself held its breath in the face of an approaching shadow. The city, imbued with the scents of blooming jasmine and the salty breath of the Mississippi, was sinking into a restless sleep under the muffled sounds of the embankments. In one of the typical houses on the corner of Magnolia and Upper Line Streets, where the Italian immigrant family Maggio resided, the silence was broken not by the creak of old floorboards, but by a barely audible, rhythmic sound of metal gnawing into dry wood. An unknown figure, with astonishing, almost supernatural composure, removed the lower panel of the back door, creating a narrow passage just wide enough to silently slip inside. This was no ordinary robber seeking easy spoils from the pockets of honest laborers, nor a random vagrant looking for a place to sleep. This was the harbinger of an entire era of terror that would forever change the face of America's most musical and mystical city. When the first morning rays of sun illuminated the room, it became clear that the night guest had left behind not empty safes, but the tragic end of a worldly journey for two spouses, whose lives concluded right in their marital bed. At the scene, only a heavy tool belonging to the owners themselves remained, and a frightening absence of any signs of struggle or stolen valuables. Thus began one of the most mysterious and chilling pages in the history of Louisiana, when a shadow with an axe became the only real law on streets where carefree fun and the sounds of early jazz usually reigned. New Orleans at the beginning of the 20th century was a unique melting pot, where the hopes and hidden fears of thousands of people who had come here in search of a better life simmered. The city was still recovering from the consequences of the First World War, trying to contain the spread of the Spanish flu, and stood on the verge of Prohibition, which promised to turn illicit trade into a gold mine for those who were not afraid of risk. In this complex social landscape, the Italian diaspora occupied a special, extremely vulnerable position. Owning many small grocery stores, bakeries, and general stores, these people were the backbone of urban supply, but at the same time remained strangers to the indigenous population. It was they, the humble suppliers of bread and vegetables, who became the first targets for the mysterious entity that newspapers would soon dub the Axeman. By mid-June 1918, panic began to slowly but surely engulf the neighborhoods. The next target was a young woman whose life was cut short as she peacefully rested in her apartment, located directly above a shop. The crime scene repeated itself with frightening precision. A neatly, almost surgically cut door panel, the use of household tools found at the scene, and absolute indifference to gold or cash. The police were in deep confusion, as the classical motives that guided criminals of the past simply did not work here. A logical and frightening question arose. Why these particular people? Why did someone who wanted to remain unnoticed choose such a sophisticated, laborious, and noisy method of entering a dwelling? The external conflict of this story unfolded against the backdrop of a fierce confrontation between law enforcement and an invisible aggressor who always seemed to be one step ahead. City authorities were under unprecedented pressure from the public and the press, which spared no gruesome details and sensational headlines. Mayor Martin Berman and Police Chief John Duffy publicly assured citizens that the culprit would be found as soon as possible. But in reality, the investigation constantly ran into a brick wall of no evidence. The police's main theory revolved around the activities of secret societies, such as the Black Hand, a prototype of future mafia structures that engaged in systematic extortion from their own compatriots. The investigation suggested that the Axeman was a mercenary, punishing those who refused to pay the underscore, quote, underscore, zero, underscore. However, the logic of the subject's actions did not fit into the pragmatic framework of organized crime. Criminal syndicates of that time were focused on profit, while this character demanded the ending of lives and did so with a certain perverted, almost ritualistic consistency. The economic and social damage to the city was enormous. People stopped visiting shops, fearing they would become accidental witnesses or the next victims, and nightly police patrols only intensified the atmosphere of martial law. The urban space turned into a battlefield where one side had absolute initiative and knowledge of the terrain, while the other helplessly awaited the next blow, frantically clutching weapons. The political situation in New Orleans during that period only added fuel to the fire. The city administration was involved in a series of corruption scandals, and the emergence of the elusive criminal became an ideal pretext for the opposition to accuse the authorities of complete incompetence. Newspapers waged a real information war. While some publications called for calm, others turned every new incident into a bloody show, detailing the placement of tools at the crime scenes. This created a situation in which the police were forced to act hastily, often arresting random people simply to report to the enraged population. For example, in one case, the brothers of a deceased shopkeeper came under suspicion simply because they were the first to discover the crime scene. Innocent people spent weeks behind bars while their reputations and life's work crumbled before their eyes. This external chaos, born of the impotence of the law and the aggression of the press, created an ideal breeding ground for the Axeman to continue his actions, feeling utterly unpunished in this labyrinth of political intrigues and social enmity. The internal conflict of every New Orleans resident during those anxious days lay in the fundamental destruction of a basic sense of security. The concept of, quote, one ceased to exist, turning into a bitter irony. Personal dramas unfolded behind closed shutters, where suspicion and paranoia became the daily norm. Neighbors who had exchanged pleasantries and shared holiday dinners for years suddenly began to see each other as potential threats. This was especially acutely felt within the Italian community. On the one hand, they were the aggressor's primary targets. On the other hand, it was they whom the police and native townspeople suspected of concealing information about internal feuds. Every head of a household faced an unbearable dilemma: to remain in the city, continuing to develop the shop bought with their last savings and thereby exposing their children to mortal danger, or to abandon everything and flee into the unknown. The internal dialogues of the townspeople were imbued with fatalism and mystical horror. Many were sincerely convinced that divine retribution for numerous sins or the machinations of dark forces had fallen upon the city, against which all earthly precautions were powerless. The individuals involved in these events lost sleep and sanity from the constant anticipation of that very sound of a door panel being sawn through. Every rustle outside the window, every cry of a night bird was perceived as the beginning of a fatal finale. Moreover, the psychological pressure on the residents was intensified by the city's specific architecture. Houses with thin walls and open verandas designed to escape the debilitating Louisiana heat now seemed treacherously accessible to anyone who wished to enter. People began to rebuild their homes, boarding up emergency exits and installing heavy bolts, effectively turning their houses into voluntary prisons. Internal conflict also manifested in a crisis of faith. New Orleans was a stronghold of Catholicism, closely intertwined with local traditions. But prayers seemed to go unanswered. This generated a backlash. People began to turn to old, forbidden methods of protection. ordering amulets from local voodoo practitioners and performing rituals to cleanse thresholds. This internal schism between the civilized man of the 20th century and the frightened creatures seeking salvation in magic became one of the deepest psychological traumas of that generation. Personal relationships crumbled under the weight of mutual accusations, and children grew up in an atmosphere of constant whispers that a __0_ was lurking outside the door, ready to take them at any moment. The ideological clash at the heart of this story was even more far-reaching. Here, the rational world of nascent modern criminology and the irrational chaos of pure, causeless madness met in a deadly battle. The Axeman embodied a force that fundamentally defied the laws of logic, economics, or understandable human morality. It was a clash of the old world with its predictable motives for crimes and the new 20th century, which brought with it the phenomenon of serial acts of aggression committed for the sake of the process itself, not for profit. In this context, New Orleans became the arena for a grand philosophical dispute. Can modern society protect itself from someone who is not afraid of the end of their life and does not pursue material goals? The paradox was that the aggressor used an axe, the oldest symbol of creation, a tool with which houses were built and forests cleared, for the systematic destruction of human lives. This caused a profound dissonance in public consciousness. How could something so mundane and useful suddenly turn into a symbol of absolute infernal evil? The conflict of ideas also concerned the perception of the city itself. On the one hand, New Orleans aspired to become a modern industrial center, the one of the country. On the other hand, it was still mired in a swamp of old prejudices and racial intolerance. The Axeman, through his actions, exposed all these hidden cracks. The idea that a criminal could be __2_, a respected citizen by day and a demon by night, undermined the very foundations of the social contract. Two systems of values clashed: belief in progress, science, and fingerprints versus an ancient primal fear of the __3_. This confrontation made people question the very essence of human nature. Were these events a result of social inequality? Or does something dark always slumber within man, just waiting for an excuse to emerge? The ideological struggle also played out in the realm of culture. Jazz, which at the time was considered by many to be questionable and even dangerous music, suddenly found itself at the center of events, becoming a kind of litmus test for the city's resilience and readiness for change. A cardinal transformation of the entire situation and perception of events occurred on March 13, 1919. It was on this day that a message arrived at the editorial offices of the largest city newspapers, the content of which made even the most inveterate skeptics and cynics shudder. The text of the letter was permeated with unprecedented arrogance, cold confidence, and a gloomy, almost otherworldly poeticism. The author declared that he was not a human in the usual sense of the word, but a spirit, a demon, come from the deepest and darkest depths of non-existence. He mocked the police's attempts to catch him, asserting that he was invisible and intangible, like the very breath of the night wind. But the most striking and paradoxical was his specific demand to the townspeople. The author of the letter announced that on the following Tuesday night, precisely at 12:15, he intended to once again walk the streets of his __0_. However, he offered the residents a peculiar deal. He promised to spare every house and every establishment where jazz music would be playing at that hour. Quote, 1. The message read. This moment became the point of no return. The fear that had accumulated for long months instantly transformed into a surreal collective submission to the will of a madman. The Axeman's message was not just a threat. It was an act of perverted manipulation of mass consciousness that turned the entire city into participants in one giant and terrifying production. Public opinion changed overnight. If jazz was previously discussed as music for the lower strata of society, now it became the only chance for the preservation of earthly existence. This was an ironic and cruel transformation. The music of freedom, born on the streets of New Orleans as a symbol of self-expression, for one night turned into an obligatory burden, a protective amulet without which it was impossible to imagine surviving until the next morning. The entire city froze in anticipation of that very Tuesday, preparing for the strangest and loudest trial in its history. The culmination arrived on the fateful night of March 19, 1919. What happened on the streets of New Orleans during those hours had no analogues in world history. The city turned into the loudest and most vibrating metropolis on the planet. In every bar, in every underground saloon, in every luxurious hotel, and in the poorest house on the outskirts, trumpets, trombones, pianos, and drums played. Professional ensembles and amateurs, united in a single, almost hysterical impulse, performed the most fiery and loud melodies. Gramophones worked at their limits, their hoarse sounds spreading through all quarters, creating a continuous sound curtain. Even those who had previously considered jazz sinful and unworthy now feverishly turned the knobs of their musical apparatuses, afraid to stop even for a second. Composer Joseph John Davila wrote and published the sheet music for a composition called The Axeman's Jazz in the shortest possible time, which instantly became an absolute bestseller and the anthem of that night. It was an incredible and eerie sight. Thousands of people danced and sang, not out of joy or spiritual uplift, but out of paralyzing mortal terror, trying to drown out with this noise the possible footsteps of someone who might be lurking in the shadows of a nearby alley. As the clock hands approached 12:15, the tension reached its climax. The city vibrated with sounds, creating an invisible but physically palpable sound dome that, it seemed, should have scared away any darkness and any steel. It was a head-on collision of life in its loudest, most chaotic, and most vital manifestation, and the icy non-existence brought by the silent presence of the aggressor. And the miracle, in which the frightened people so believed, happened. That night, not a single act of taking a life was recorded throughout the entire city. Not a single door panel was cut, not a single tool was raised over the sleeping, not a single life was interrupted. Music truly won, or at least that's what everyone who met the dawn of that day sincerely wanted to believe. However, this triumph had a bitter taste, for it meant that an entire metropolis had acknowledged the absolute power of a madman over its collective will. The subject achieved his main goal. He forced hundreds of thousands of people to act in a single rhythm, subjecting them to his perverted taste and turning their fear into a musical offering to himself. It was the ultimate triumph of psychological manipulation, where the line between crime and a grandiose performance was finally blurred, leaving the city in a state of devastated relief. After that legendary quote zero, the Axeman's activity began to gradually fade, as if he had satisfied his curiosity and thirst for power over human souls. The attacks continued for some time, but their frequency and audacity significantly decreased. The last officially recognized case occurred in October 1919, when another Italian merchant encountered an invisible guest in his home. After that, the shadow with an axe disappeared without a trace from New Orleans, leaving behind nothing but archives of unsolved cases, hundreds of broken lives, and the eternal question of who he really was. Over all the years of investigation, the police were never able to bring official charges against any specific person whose guilt would be proven in court. The main candidate for the role of the Axeman years later became a certain Joseph Mumfree, a personality with an extremely dubious past and ties to the criminal world. His life ended with several gunshots on a street in Los Angeles in 1921. According to one of the urban legends, this was an act of retribution by the widow of one of the affected shopkeepers. However, direct, irrefutable evidence of Mumfree's involvement in the New Orleans terror was never presented, and his figure remained just one of many versions in this endless labyrinth of assumptions. The resonance of those tragic events continues to be felt today, more than a century later. The story of the Axeman has become a classic example of how one person or one irrational idea can destabilize an entire developed society, using its own internal fears, cultural codes, and social contradictions. It is an eternal reminder of how fragile and vulnerable human civilization can be in the face of unmotivated and unpredictable chaos. In modern popular culture, the image of the Axeman has transformed from a real nightmare into an archetypal character in books, films, and TV series, becoming part of dark folklore. But the true meaning of this story lies much deeper than superficial horror. It is about the discovery of the colossal power of art as the only available means of collective survival and psychological protection in conditions of total uncertainty. The jazz that the aggressor demanded became something much more than just a musical genre for New Orleans. It became a mechanism of group therapy, allowing citizens not to succumb to madness and to preserve human dignity in moments of extreme despair. We see how, even in the most hopeless times, humanity finds ways to unite, even if this unity was initially imposed from outside by a frightening force. Paradoxically, it was precisely during that period of total fear that jazz began its triumphant, victorious march around the world. The tragic events in New Orleans served as a strange and powerful catalyst for the popularization of this music, giving it an aura of some mystical, almost magical power, capable of resisting the darkest evil. The Axeman, striving to sow destruction and chaos, ultimately only strengthened the city's cultural identity, making jazz its integral symbol and sacred heritage. The conflict between the bright light of music halls and the impenetrable darkness of night alleys created that unique, attractive, and dangerous atmosphere that still draws millions of adventurers and history lovers from all corners of the globe to this city. This is a narrative of how the deepest collective trauma can be transformed into a great cultural heritage, and sustained pain into a rhythm that continues to resonate in people's hearts, despite the changing eras and generations. Today, strolling leisurely through the city's historic quarters, it's impossible not to feel the presence of the shadows of the past in the cool, humid air of old courtyards. The modern eye involuntarily lingers on paneled doors, involuntarily recalling those times when each such panel could be silently removed by an invisible and merciless guest. The lessons of the Axeman teach us that evil often remains elusive, unpunished, and devoid of a clear explanation, but it always proves powerless before the indomitable spirit of a community that finds the strength to sing, play, and dance even on the very edge of the abyss. New Orleans has kept its dark secrets, never revealing the true name of the one who held it in stupor, but it has also carefully preserved the very music that saved its inhabitants on that insane and loud night of March 19. This eternal, endless confrontation between the silent, cold metal of an instrument and the hot, screaming voice of a brass trumpet remains one of the most powerful and accurate metaphors for all human existence. Concluding this journey through time, we inevitably return to that very humid and quiet night from which this long path of terror began. Only now, in this nocturnal silence, we no longer hear the terrifying scrape of metal on dry wood, but distant, barely perceptible, yet confident sounds of a saxophone reaching us from the very depths of decades. The shadow of the Axeman has long dissolved into history, leaving behind only endless, unanswered questions and yellowed newspaper pages. But the music born from this confrontation has remained with us forever. It sounds like an eternal, life-affirming answer to anyone who ever decides to encroach on the peace and freedom of the sleeping city. And as long as jazz continues to play in the homes and on the streets of New Orleans, all the shadows of the past remain just shadows, unable to cause real harm to those who remember and honor the lessons of their history. This is a continuous cycle of fear and triumph, forever imprinted in the genetic code of this place, where each new chord is the pulse of life itself, having achieved a final victory over oblivion and chaos. The tragedy of those years vividly demonstrated that even the most terrifying, bloody, and inexplicable pages of history can become the foundation for the emergence of something far more significant and enduring than just the memory of experienced horror. The individuals who became victims of those events found a peculiar immortality in the collective memory of the people, and the city itself gained the status of a living legend, a place where reality and myth intertwined into an indissoluble knot. We look at these events through the prism of a whole century and begin to understand that true, enduring strength lies not in the sharpness of a blade or the suddenness of an attack, but in people's ability to preserve their culture, faith, and humanity, even when destruction seems to be the only inevitable outcome. This resonance continues to vibrate in the air of Louisiana, reminding us that the light of creation will always find a way to break through the densest and most hostile darkness if it has a loud enough, sincere, and confident voice. Ultimately, this whole story of the Axeman is not just another tale of unsolved crimes and forensic mysteries. It is a majestic ode to human resilience, solidarity, and the boundless power of art. Every time we hear a jazz musician's improvisation, we, without realizing it, pay deep respect to those who were not afraid to transform their paralyzing fear into a beautiful and loud melody. The city that survived and endured, thanks to music, continues its journey, celebrating each new day as a great victory over an unknown and frightening past. And in this eternal movement from the hook of primal fear to the resonance of absolute freedom lies the true, incomprehensible magic of New Orleans, which no aggressor can destroy, no matter how sharp and heavy their instrument. The final thought we take with us after this immersion into the past is the realization that our deepest fears often become fertile ground for our greatest and most significant cultural achievements. Without the menacing shadow of the Axeman, jazz might never have acquired such sacred, almost religious significance for the inhabitants of these places. This reminds us that everything in our lives is closely and inextricably interconnected, pain and joy, silence and piercing sound, destruction and inspired creativity. We close this chapter of history with a deep understanding that even the darkest and most sinister shadows of the past ultimately serve only as a necessary backdrop for the dazzlingly bright light of the human spirit, which continues its endless, joyful dance to the sounds of eternal, immortal jazz.